published 0243 the 8th of December 2017, updated 1132 the 8th of December 2017. Jailed Oliver Schmidt, 48, the former general manager in charge of VW's Environmental and Engineering Office in Michigan, received a 7-year sentence over the dieselgate scandal. Ministers in the UK could be in trouble for encouraging millions of Britons to buy diesel cars for years, then cracking down on them, while a US Volkswagen senior manager has been jailed over dieselgate. A senior manager at Volkswagen was jailed for 7 years in the U.S. this week over the car firm's dieselgate scandal. Oliver Schmidt, 48, was convicted of concealing software used to evade pollution limits on around 11 million vehicles, predominantly diesels, around the world. In Britain, law firm Harkus Sinclair, which spearheaded the current UK class action against the German car giant in January, said the government has a case to answer over the way consumers have been misled and then punished for buying diesel cars as the dash for diesel turned into its demonization. Damon Parker, partner at law firm Harkus Sinclair, told Consumer Magazine Auto Express, "There is evidence that previous government promoted diesel car sales on a knowingly false basis. On the basis of the evidence, the government has a case to answer. The tactic of forcing diesel owners to part with their vehicles through financial penalties is not only unfairly prejudicial, but may go so far as to be unlawful and subject to challenge." While drivers affected by the scandal in the U.S. have been offered compensation, VW has refused to pay off drivers in the UK. However, ministers could now be in trouble for deliberately incentivizing millions of Britons to buy diesel cars for years, a move that one law firm has dubbed unlawful and could leave the government open to a major legal challenge. Schmidt is the second employee to be imprisoned in the U.S. over the emissions scandal, which has cost the company almost £22 billion. VW first admitted it had used illegal software to cheat U.S. emissions tests in September 2015. Cars were recalled after it emerged that the defeat devices were used so vehicles performed better during the emissions tests than under normal driving conditions. The true emissions were sometimes 30 times higher than permitted under U.S. rules. Schmidt, who was the general manager in charge of VW's Environmental and Engineering Office in Michigan, admitted his part in the cover-up but argued he was misused by the company in its attempts to circumvent emissions tests. However, Judge Sean Cox ruled he was a key conspirator in the scheme and used the opportunity to climb the corporate ladder. James Liang, a former VW engineer, was sentenced to more than 3 years in August. The VW Group admitted to defrauding the U.S. government by using software to get around emission standards, but it isn't just Volkswagen employees facing potential legal action following dieselgate. Harkus Sinclair's assessment comes weeks after Chancellor Philip Hammond announced new diesel car tax increases in the autumn budget. London's Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan has also introduced a charge where owners of older diesel and petrol cars have to pay an additional £10 to drive into the capital's congestion zone. That could spread to the north and south circular road under ultra-low emissions proposals for 2019. Islington Council in North London is introducing an additional £2 parking levy for diesel owners from 2018, too. London Mayor Sadiq Khan implemented the charge in the capital from October this year. Islington Council was also the first UK local authority to charge residents an extra £96 a year for a parking permit if they owned a diesel. Both this and the short-stay parking charge doesn't take into consideration if you drive one of the latest cleaner Euro 6 standard diesel cars. The dash for diesel originally began under Tony Blair's Labour government as tax incentives introduced by his Chancellor Gordon Brown sparked the huge rise in the number of diesel cars on UK roads as ministers concentrated on lowering emissions of carbon dioxide (CO2), the greenhouse gas blamed for global warming. To meet 1997 Kyoto Agreement targets, diesel cars were recommended as they emit around 15% less carbon dioxide than the equivalent petrol models. But ministers ignored the potential danger from particulates, which are now blamed for up to 40,000 premature deaths a year. In 2001, Labour Chancellor Gordon Brown lowered vehicle excise duty for diesels and reduced the duty paid on diesel, which was promoted as a green fuel, so sales of diesel cars, which in the 1990s were driven by around 1 in 20 motorists, soared to the point where today there are around 12 million diesels on Britain's roads, representing more than a third of all cars and 4 times as many as in 2000. A third of Volkswagen cars fitted with software to cheat emissions tests remain unfixed, new figures showed last month. The rate at which vehicles are being dealt with has stalled, according to Mary Krieg, chair of the Commons Environmental Audit Committee. She obtained figures from the Department for Transport which show that only around 2/3 of the 1.2 million vehicles affected in the UK had been fixed as of September. Analysis shows that the rate of fixes has declined from a high of 10% of affected cars per month in February to just 2%. Krieg said it is over 2 years since the VW emissions scandal was discovered. A third of vehicles have yet to be fixed and rates have slowed considerably. We have written to the Department for Transport to ask what action they are taking in response to this stalled progress. It is essential that the vehicles on Britain's roads adhere to emissions regulations, particularly as the country is faced with dangerous levels of pollution. The department must take responsibility for ensuring that these fixes are completed as soon as possible, Mr. Park said. New evidence suggests that the Blair-Brown tax incentives were introduced despite ministers knowing that air quality would decline if diesel sales rose. Diesel owners were consequently fooled into believing that they were doing the environmentally responsible thing and buying a less polluting vehicle, generally at a higher cost than the petrol equivalent, when they were doing nothing of the kind, he added. Today, the same vehicles successive governments pushed on the back of their environmental qualities are now being hit by additional tax and other monetary deterrents. The loss is that individual motorists who bought their cars in good faith and in reliance on past governments' false promises will have suffered or considerable. The most significant cost, however, is likely to lie in the diminution of the residual value of the vehicles, Mr. Parker argued. Having created a false market by falsely extolling diesel's environmental credentials, the government is now helping create the stigma which is driving down second-hand values. Lower-income families will be the worst hit. Many will have paid over the odds for cars they now ought to sell because they are costing them too much to keep, but having sold them, they will not be able to afford equivalent replacement petrol cars. This is quite apart from the feeling of guilt that public-spirited people will feel when they start their cars, knowing that they are damaging the environment instead of doing their bit, he said. Tony Blair's former chief scientist Sir David King, whose advice helped convince Chancellor Brown to introduce his 2001 tax changes, admitted in April this year that scientists were aware that diesel was really a dirty fuel that belched out harmful particulates and nitrous oxides, but did nothing about it. He admitted he was aware of the warnings, including from the government's own medical advisors in 1999, that diesel engines produced more dangerous fumes, but suggested he'd been convinced by car manufacturers that new catalytic converters would deal with the problem. Sir David told the BBC Today programme, "I think as it turns out, were wrong," ahead of the current Conservative government being forced after a legal challenge to publish in July its recent air quality plan, which aims to ban all non-hybrid diesel and petrol cars by 2040. Prime Minister Theresa May said, "I'm very conscious of the fact that past governments have encouraged people to buy diesel cars and we need to take that into account." Files obtained by the BBC under the Freedom of Information Act, after a 2-year battle with the Treasury, reveal officials dismissed warnings about diesel for representational reasons, amid fears that the government would be seen as overly harsh on diesel users. They show that officials had been advised that such a decision could leave the government vulnerable to criticism of doing too little on local air quality. Diesel cars were recommended by the previous government because they emit around 15% less carbon dioxide than petrol and therefore have less of an impact on climate change. Michael Gove, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, said Labour had recommended diesel despite knowing the damage it caused. Environment Secretary Michael Gove said the revelation proved that Labour had enabled a dash for diesel, despite knowing that it could damage air quality. 2 years ago, an unidentified former senior civil servant told The Guardian newspaper that 20 years ago the choice was between killing people today rather than saving lives tomorrow. Howard Cox, of campaign group Fair Fulick, said they themselves are consulting lawyers with a view to mounting their own legal challenge. He said, "Millions of motorists were hoodwinked by the government into buying diesel cars and are now being demonized and penalized for it. We believe there is a case for action against the government for misleading drivers and against Sadiq Khan over his unfair charge." AA President Edmund King said that while it was unclear whether a legal challenge could succeed, it is clear the government misled millions of drivers over diesel.